use their power to destroy other enemies.
Crash, jacking only works in a game.
Hey guys, today we're going to review Radical Entertainment's second Crash Bandicoot game, Crash of the Titans, the black sheep of Crash games. While it did well critically, a lot of fans hate this game. Why? Because it strays away from the basic hallway gameplay of the original PlayStation and tries to create something new and fresh for the series? Yes. After years of games that failed to capture the iconic feel of the Naughty Dog games, Radical came in to give Crash some new flavor. After finishing off tag team racing, they decided to expand beyond the standard platforming with new mechanics and character designs. And that's essentially why people hate this game, because it's different. All you hear is, I don't like how the characters look, or the game plays different from the PS1 game so it's bad, or this game ruined my childhood, you know, the classic. That's it. Shallow arguments that don't mean much in the grand scheme of things. Fans don't actually explain how the game is bad. They fail to give it a worthwhile analysis and just regurgitate the same uninformed garbage over and over again. It's more about the fact that it's a Crash Bandicoot game than the actual quality of the game. Some fans say it's a good game, but it's not a good Crash Bandicoot game, which basically means it's a good game, but because it has Crash Bandicoot in the title, well, doesn't work. Well, Radical haven't exactly erased everything that makes this a Crash Bandicoot game. The fans just don't look at this game beyond what's on the surface. In case you couldn't tell by now, my opinion of this game is very divisive, so this should be fun. If you're a fanboy of the Naughty Dog games, you may not like me after watching this video, but that's okay, I don't like you either. So without further ado, let's take an in-depth look at Crash's most controversial adventure.
Yahoo!
Oh yeah, I'm reviewing the story, so spoilers for anyone that cares. Booting up the game gives you this really cool illustration before the title screen. I think it's more of a prologue. Though this is confusing since Uka Uka is the one responsible for the Titans, not Nina. And why is Crash growing out of the ground? I never really understood that. He was created in a lab in Crash 1, and this game canonically takes place after Twinsanity. It's not a reboot or anything like that. I don't know, man, we're not even 5 minutes into the game and the story is already confusing. But even though the opening doesn't seem to make much sense, I personally love the animation. It's charming and it looks fucking awesome. You can already tell that this game has personality. So moving on to the real opening for the game gang is just chilling, you know, with the same childish potty humor tag team racing had.
Hey, that was a good one!
All of a sudden, Cortex's giant airship comes out of nowhere to kick off the plot. He kidnaps Aku Aku and Coco, and then freezes Crunch in place after missing Crash. Why? To do bad things. Wow, what an intro. In episode 4, Cortex reveals that he's going to be building a doomsday robot known as the Doominator, which he'll use to smash Wumpa Island and take over the world. You know, nothing crazy. Having Coco tied up just for the sake of the plot. Cortex is basically stealing something called Mojo and using it to create a huge army of loyal mutants. Not rejects like Crash and Coco. So from here on out, the game seems pretty straightforward. You're just off to stop Cortex like past games, right? Well, not exactly. There's a little twist. Uka Uka gets tired of Cortex's incompetence, so he decides to replace him with his more competent niece, Nina Cortex. Nina takes over Cortex's plan and uses Coco to help finish building Cortex's Doominator, so she's technically considered the main antagonist here. We also come across some other bad guys too along the way, but we'll get more into that later. You gotta give credit to some of the post-Naughty Dog games for not recycling Cortex as the main antagonist all the time, and Cortex being dumped actually does make sense. Uka Uka has complained about Cortex's failures in the past, but he never actually went out of his way to fire him and line up a replacement. When you consider how many times Cortex has failed up until this point, it's a good concept. It shows continuity and makes Titans somewhat less predictable, especially since Nina never really had a chance to truly shine, seeing how quiet and underutilized she was in Twinsanity. I think one of my biggest pet peeves is how Crunch is frozen throughout most of the game, only being seen at both the beginning and ending of the game. The fact that he waits to the end of the game to break through the ice also makes no sense. I mean, couldn't he have just done that earlier? Looks like they just wanted Crunch out of the way to progress the plot, and that's disappointing. If Titans had more playable characters like they had originally planned, this may not have happened. It's really just stupid inconsistencies that you notice in this game's story. For example, Aku Aku teaching you how to play the game makes sense, but it's funny how in episode 1 he's doing it while he's literally captured in a cage. And how does that little ass cage even hold a magical talking mask anyway? I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it. Well, Aku Aku does briefly discuss the limitations of his powers in the game here and there, but seeing how he can only teleport us to new locations when it's convenient for the plot, it's not very convincing.
Freedom!
Most of the old villains don't appear in this game either. I don't know why, it might be because they don't want to redesign more characters, time constraints, or maybe they thought many of them wouldn't work well in this game, it's whatever. I'm sure Radical just wanted to focus more on the mutants you fight throughout the game instead, and that makes sense. We wouldn't want another game that shows us classic villains but doesn't use them. Now would we? Thankfully the game makes up for it with all the Titans, and the game is still more interesting than every game in the original trilogy, hands down. But despite the interesting twist with Nina, the story kinda sucks. It really gives a lot to improve upon for the game's sequel. I mean, it still works for what Titans is going for, it just feels kinda forced and dumb. I know plot isn't that important in a Crash Bandicoot game, but if more thought were put into the game's narrative, it could have been much better. Now, I want to touch on the game's characters more. I'm gonna start with Crash. To be honest, Crash looks fucking awesome in this game. He's cute, he's got the designer jeans on, he's got the tribal tattoos. The tattoos glow when you jack mutants and it looks fucking sick, man. People have a lot to say about this design, but the tattoos won't bother you if you're not a pussy. Coco, on the other hand, is really just a female Jimmy Neutron. She has the same voice as Jimmy Neutron with little to no difference in voice direction compared to games like, let's say, Nitro Kart or something. Titan's Coco is much better than Naughty Dog's, but she doesn't really shine much in this game. While I think Nitro Kart, Tag Team Racing, and Mind Over Mutant handled both her character and design much better, I don't think her character here is bad. She's a good plot device for the game, right? But seriously, why would anyone make a gizmo just to recycle butter? What kind of lame-ass invention is that? Oh, and her hair sucks.
You jerk.
Then there's Crunch, who is just a knockoff Mr. T. I do think the old Kevin Michael Richardson Crunch was a lot cooler, specifically in Nitro Kart. Though Mr. T Crunch is still a fun pop culture reference that I like.
Cover your mouth when you sneeze!
At least Radical did more with him than Traveler's Tales.
I could take this Crash punk out with my metal arm tied behind my back.
Aku Aku and Uka Uka, on the other hand, aren't really much different from past games personality-wise. They just look and sound different. Uka Uka looks more menacing, while Aku Aku looks, I don't know, more expressive yet kinda ugly. He's now voiced by Greg Eagles, who did Grimm's voice in Billy and Mandy. And I think Greg Eagles fits his character pretty well. While Uka Uka is voiced by John DiMaggio, who did Dr. Draken's voice in Kim Possible, and Bender from Futurama. Clancy's Uka Uka is classic, but John's Uka Uka voice is godly. Uka Uka's design here, though, is kinda like, what the fuck? He looks nothing like Uka Uka. Although he does look kinda badass, I never was all that into it. And then we have Dr. Cortex, the creepy egomaniacal school shooter we all know and love. Well, he's not portrayed as menacing at all in this game. In Twinsanity, there was a charming balance between serious and humorous, while here he is more or less just a wacky Saturday morning cartoon villain. I personally never found this to be a problem given how amazing Lex Lang's Cortex is, but Cortex doesn't have a lot going for him other than being a pathetic loser. But that's pretty much a part of the game's narrative anyway. It's okay, we still love your Cortex.
Thank you.
But Nina's still way cooler. In fact, Radical Entertainment's Nina in particular is amazing. In Twinsanity, she didn't speak and she was just kinda there for the sake of adding a new character to progress the plot. Presumably due to the cut content, she was a huge waste of potential. She really didn't have any personality until Radical gave her a voice in Tag Team Racing. In Titan, she's a sharp antagonist that really means business. She's like a psychotic dictator, and while she's still an immature child, she isn't messing around. It's no surprise her uncle loves her so much, right? Now Engine, man, he's fucking awesome in this game. Nolan North gives him more character than he's ever had in the entire series. He steals every scene he's in, and he's by far the most animated character in this game. He's just as mentally unstable as you would expect a guy with a rocket in his head to be.
Let's just dance, baby!
The Naughty Dog one pales in comparison. While Engine doesn't have much screen time, he's pretty great, just saying. And lastly, we have our boy Tiny. You know I had to save the best for last. Tiny is a much different character here, and a lot of people hate how Radical portrayed him in this game.
Crash, I really am cross with you. I'm just trying to do my job, and you go and cause all this chaos. I'm sorry, but I'm gonna have to eat your face.
Tiny is now a Mike Tyson reference. A lot of people tend to hate his new look, hate his new voice, and hate how he's more in touch with his feminine side. As a proud supporter of the lesbian, gay, bisexual tiger community, I see nothing wrong with the change in Tiny's character. You guys just can't hate him for being gay. That's homophobic. Tiny has rights, man. Right, Tiny?
Stop! No more, please!
Okay, but seriously, this Tiny is fucking hilarious. And I never took him seriously. Not as a kid, not as an adult, I never did. It really is questionable though. Tiny regressed into being bitch-made without any real explanation. It's almost like he represents modern day men. While Naughty Dog Tiny was stale and hard to understand, I think Nitro Kart's portrayal of Tiny is the best. Since the voice acting is better and he manages to be easier to understand without a drastic change to his character. I think it would be better if Tiny was a different character here since he looks and acts nothing like Tiny at all. They really did this man wrong. Maybe they should have introduced him as Tiny's gay cousin or something. I don't know, it could have worked. But I don't think of Tiny's character in Titans as a huge problem. I think of it as a joke that can only be found in this game. The thing is, most of the characters in the Naughty Dog games barely had any personality to begin with, and many of them didn't even have a decent portrayal until Nitro Kart. Radical made a lot of these characters more interesting, including Tiny, since he originally was just a generic, stupid, angry tiger. And some characters like Engine and Nina are much better here than they've ever been. It's really not something I would complain about. And you can tell all the voice actors were having a blast playing all these characters. They recorded over 7,000 lines to avoid repetitive audio, and they recorded each line 3 times to achieve a more natural feel for the dialogue. The conversations you can hear from a distance of the minions interacting with each other were specifically done to make the enemies more memorable, and it definitely succeeds. The minions in particular have these fun and sometimes annoying cartoony voices, many of which are delivered by legends like Tom Kenny and John DiMaggio.
Bang the bang bang bang!
The boring generic henchmen from the Naughty Dog games are long gone. The minions here have actual personality, while all the main cast has an actual identity here. The fact that characters say the names in the end credits alone is another detail that's often overlooked by many. The humor wasn't handled perfectly though, and I have mixed feelings about it. While I enjoy how fun and goofy this game is, the writing is hit or miss. It has both subtle and obvious sexual adult humor sprinkled throughout the game despite the rating, but it also has some jokes that feel like they're written for kindergartners. Yes, there has to be humor in a game that kids will understand, but that doesn't mean kids should be treated like this. Kids in the E10 Plus demographic can understand jokes with a little substance to it. I'm sorry, even when I was 10, the burp jokes and jokes about pancakes and bacon, those just weren't funny. It's forced, and I'm sure most kids above the age of 6 wouldn't find this funny. If you can make a joke about abortion and have Cortex call his niece a skank, then you can come up with better jokes than this, man. I actually like the humor in this game when it's actually being clever. Like when Uka Uka said he'll get the last laugh, then he said he's laughing now too, just in case. But when it's trying too hard to be funny, it gives off this really corny vibe. Sure, it's engagifying and all, but excessive immaturity isn't necessary, and I can understand why this would turn older kids and adults off. Yes, this is still a good game for kids, but Crash started off as a series that can easily appeal to any demographic, so show it a bit more respect with the writing. Regardless, the characters are still a lot of fun and they add personality to the game. They're all well animated, well, not counting this cutscene. Of course, I didn't want to touch on the character designs too much since I don't really think they're all that important. I understand that these designs can be a bit unsettling at first for fans of the older games, but if you don't focus on it, it's really not a big deal. The style is unique and they fit the aesthetic of the game. With that being said, all of the original trilogy's characters are bland, monotone, and they have very little entertainment value compared to Crash of the Titans.
You monster!
Since when can Crash do that?
Crash of the Titans is essentially a beat-em-up platformer. This means the game is centered around both fighting and platforming. Unlike the previous Crash games where combat was kept simple with just a basic spin, slide, and slam attack, there's a lot more going on here. You can punch, spin, kick, and more, all in the form of both light attacks and heavy attacks. Pretty standard for a beat 'em up, right? Instead of Crash dying in one hit and collecting max for hit points, Aku Aku can be used to block enemy attacks directly. Some attacks are too strong for Aku Aku's face, so in that case you'll have to dodge instead. So yeah, Titans is radically different from past games mechanically. I'd say the enemy variety is one of the most interesting aspects of the game. Here we aren't just spinning away generic animals and henchmen who do nothing but the same animation over and over again. Here instead, we have a variety of enemies with unique designs. The small minions I mentioned earlier are the standard enemies. They get tougher as you progress, although they don't get any smarter.
Hit me as hard as you can.
The main gimmick in Crash of the Titans is the ability to jack mutants. I know that sounds fucking weird, but yes, we're jacking mutants. You do this by first knocking out a mutant, which will give you the ability to control them using Aku Aku. This is used for combat, basic puzzles, or smashing larger objects. There are two main types of mutants, melee mutants and range mutants. The melee mutants all come in small, medium, and large sizes with a variety of attacks. It's always exciting going to a new level and discovering a new mutant to jack. The Battler is my personal favorite, given just how badass they look and feel to control. Scorporilla is pretty good too, since he's extremely overpowered and a joy to use whenever you're surrounded by enemies. The ranged mutants by comparison feel kind of underpowered. These mutants are primarily used to destroy objects from farther away, such as targets, or just hit enemies from a distance. They're fun to use sometimes, but they're not that useful. They do each have a melee attack, but it's slow and pretty terrible. And their health is also pretty low, especially on the fucking snipe. I think their addition was necessary to add more variety to the mutants, but you'll have more fun with the other mutants since they can hit multiple enemies at once a lot faster. What's really stupid about the ranged mutants is that you can just hide in a corner and spam because the AI never blocks projectiles, despite you, the player, being able to. When doing this, the AI can't even see you for some reason. The AI does occasionally block melee attacks, but how often they block, of course, depends on what difficulty you choose. Fortunately, their stupidity can be used to your advantage when you feel overwhelmed. The game's difficulty settings are easy, normal, and hard. You know, pretty simple, right? I've played through the game in all difficulties, and the differences between difficulties are important. On easy, Crash runs, jumps, and dies a lot slower. Easy difficulty is very forgiving and is good for some casual players to get into the game for the first time, or make you feel better for being garbage at the game. I personally hate easy mode because I think it's boring as fuck. The game moves way too slow and it makes everything feel a lot more tedious. But to be fair, I played on easy a lot as a kid, so I naturally grew out of it, right? Now, normal difficulty, it's very balanced, but it can still kick your ass from time to time if you're new to the game. I remember normal difficulty being too much for me when I was younger until I got better at the game and used to the mechanics. And hard difficulty, on the other hand, that's the opposite of easy, obviously, right? Everything in the game moves a lot faster and you have to be careful. The smallest bits of damage will kill you. Hard difficulty is for people that really want a challenge, and I would never recommend it to a new player. It can get very frustrating, even for me now. It doesn't matter if you're good at the game, that shit does not play around. And sometimes it's just straight up unfair. And sometimes on hard, I experience this glitch where I lose all of my health while I'm in the middle of jacking a mutant. So the death music starts playing while I'm still alive with the mutant jacked. Then as soon as I unjack the mutant, I just die. That is fucking bullshit. But hey, you get free kick if you beat the game on hard, so at least you won't be abusing your controller for nothing. For me, normal mode is when I want a more casual playthrough, and hard is when I'm feeling a little edgy and I'm down for something more rough around the edges. But again, if you're new to the game, stick to easy or normal unless you want to get stuck all the time. You might need to get used to the mechanics on your first playthrough, so choose wisely. It would be nice if the game's level design changed slightly based on what difficulty you choose, like Rugrats Royal Ransom did, for example. They could have adjusted the platforming and combat sections to the difficulty, just a little idea. While it has its quirks, I would say the combat system in Crash of the Titans is generally balanced and a lot of fun. The proper combat system gives you a lot more options during gameplay, and it makes combat more interesting than it's ever been. But unfortunately, again, the AI is fucking retarded. The AI is always getting confused when you're not within a certain boundary of an enemy. It's ridiculous. Even on hard difficulty, the enemies just start breaking in certain areas and they still have the tendency to not even notice you when you're standing right in front of them. I mean, just look at this. What, is he shy or something? They don't always run after you when you're nearby and they're kinda just, well, stupid. It's weird. What I really like about the combat though is this really cool grace period in the middle of certain animations where you can't get hurt. It happens while jacking a mutant or when you're in the middle of a strong attack sequence. This prevents bullshit hits, but sadly the gyro jackhammer still breaks on you from time to time, so get used to that. What's really stupid is that when you replay episodes, you can't skip any of the cutscenes. When you're playing a game where the story isn't really that important, it's strange for the developers to not let you skip them, especially when you already completed the level or beat the game in general. Obviously, the game doesn't feel like the past games at all. It feels different, but really it just gets a bad rep for trying something new in this franchise. And while I'm sure the game didn't turn out exactly the way they intended, it's still executed pretty decently. People really stress that this doesn't feel like a Crash game, and that it would be better off as a new IP. I believe that this kind of mindset is trying to cripple Crash Bandicoot from exploring other creative directions in other genres. No one ever said every Crash game from here on out had to be a beat-em-up platformer. It's just an experiment, and it's good to experiment so your franchise has more variety than just running through hallways or riding in vehicles every single game. That's why I'm glad Radical made this game. And people really overlook a lot of stuff in this game. The game still has a lot of features that the classic games had, they just tie it in with the game's design. It still has linear gameplay, except you have a lot more space to run around. The fixed camera isn't as restricted. Radical also did a great job of auto-adjusting the camera to zoom in and out when necessary. Well, most of the time anyway. Time relics are replaced with medals. You can get higher medals from finding and destroying spy bots, fighting minions, and getting high combos. There are also optional voodoo dolls hidden in every level that give you concept art. And the bonus stages are replaced with mojo rooms with all sorts of different challenges, and they're a lot of fun. Whether it's collecting green mojo, defeating all the enemies, or destroying all the bombs, there's just a lot of variety here. There are many challenges just like the old bonus pass in the originals, they're just adjusted to fit the style of the game. Unfortunately, there are no death routes, but that's not a big deal. Oh, and remember the character bios in Crash 1? Titans has them too, just with Aku Aku voicing over it this time. You still smash crates and collect Wumpa Fruit like the classic games, except you can smash a lot more than just crates. In fact, you can smash practically anything. Well, except for Coco. And when you do break things, you get Mojo, which gradually upgrades your abilities. You can literally collect as much as you want at any given moment. This can vary from new moves to health upgrades. I think this is cooler than fighting easy bosses just so you can run faster or do a double jump like in Crash 3. And even though it's dated and pointless, Titans has lives like the original trilogy did, except you can get as many lives as you want, which means Wumpa Fruit is now just used to replenish health, while Gold Wumpa Fruit gives you an extra life. The platforming in the original games were designed around precision and getting the jumps right. The platforming in Titans is designed around flexibility and freedom.
Freedom!
Crash can grab ledges and even ride across them very quickly. He can bounce on bouncy platforms and swing on ropes. He can do different kinds of jumps like spin jumps and backflips. Hell, Crash can even slide around on Aku Aku's face like a skateboard. Yeah, let's see your puny Naughty Dog games do that.
Oh, I could wail into these nerds all day.
Crash control is really good too. The game makes Crash feel more fleshed out and platforming flows real nicely this time around. It's definitely at least an improvement over the sloppy platforming we had in Tag Team Racing. After leaving Wumpa Island, we get to explore a desert, a volcano, a beach, heavy machinery, Uka Uka's lair, the Doominator, you get the idea. There's some decent location variety here. The environments are always changing and you generally don't spend more than a few levels with the same scenery. And here's something new. If you happen to have a buddy that wants to play with you, good news, the game has co-op. While it does make the game easier overall, the co-op made in Titans is unique. Basically, when one player decides they want to take a break, they can just get in the other player's backpack while the other player continues to play. Unfortunately, the game defaults to leapfrog mode, which means every time the player jumps, both players switch places. I never found this practical, and I always switch back to piggyback mode in the pause menu instead. This basically means you carry the other player in your backpack until they decide to jump out. I remember as a kid I used to hook up a second controller just to play as Carbon Crash while keeping the original Crash in my backpack. And if you want, you can just take the original Crash out altogether. That's always fun. However, the game takes a very strange approach when it comes to the boss fights. Instead of it just being you versus one boss, it's a variation of other things. In the Yuctopus fight, you take on a giant mutant along with smaller mutants you have to jack in order to build up enough strength to jack the captain mutant. The game calls this a food chain. All of this is happening while Cortex is just sitting there doing absolutely nothing. Yes, the guy who has a ray gun and fucking jet boots or whatever you want to call them, he does nothing. So while we're technically beating Cortex, we're not actually fighting him directly. In these fights, you're taking control of the boss and destroying the area around him. This is something you don't really see in a lot of other games to my knowledge. And those are just the food chain fights. We also have fights like this, where instead of fighting Tiny, we just stand there and he watches us fight a bunch of mutants until we destroy the targets on the door, which stops them from spawning. Then Tiny runs away like a coward. This is also the case with Engine, where all you're doing is fighting mutants you literally fought earlier in the level. Meanwhile, Engine just stands there playing a giant piano, doing nothing but yelling random words.
Stop it, Daddy!
These are not boss fights. These are gauntlets, and they're not much to write home about. Past games had memorable bosses, but this game, not so much. The Uka Uka fight, however, is probably the best one. It's challenging and a breath of fresh air from that Twinsanity fight that even the Voodoo Bunnies thought was disappointing.
He had body briefly in Twinsanity, but that was no fun for nobody.
I mean, they're not wrong. That fight in Twinsanity was too short and easy, unlike this fight. Too bad it's broken. You can actually defeat Uka Uka without completing the food chain 3 times by just jacking and unjacking him at the right time after you shoot an electrical thingy. Wow, that sounds weird. I mean, it's fun, especially when you're obsessed with the jacking animations like me. Also sounds weird, but it's fucking broken. And Nina's fight, despite being the final boss, is easier than the Uka Uka fight. Just spam Scorporilla's overpowered secret attack, or get really close to her, then use the special attack for a one-hit knockout. If you know how to do this, easy jack, easy win. While the arena fights are terrible, I have to say that I do enjoy the strange food chain bosses in this game. It's unique, and taking control of the boss is a lot of fun. And I'm not sure if the health exploit was done on purpose or not, but the Yuctopus fight seems to be the least broken out of all these fights. We also have unlockable skins based on enemies. These skins allow you to have one-hit kills for a particular enemy. They look really solid, and they manage to improve the gameplay rather than just being there for cosmetics. One complaint I have is, why can't the Magmadon skin protect me from lava? Or why can't the Sludge skin stop me from burning on toxic waste? Or why can't the Ratsicle skin stop me from slipping and sliding? Missed opportunity. Nonetheless, the gameplay of Titans is essentially just, you do a little platforming, fight some enemies, then take a break and do some more platforming again. Maybe throw a little sliding segments here and there too, and rinse, recycle, repeat. The levels are paced really well, and it's always nice to have breaks from combat in between. While combat can be overwhelming at times, there are no gimmicky vehicle levels, no crystals, no gems, and very little backtracking. Unlike Tag Team Racing, a game obsessed with variety for the sake of it, Titans knows what it wants to be. A stylistic beat-em-up platformer. Just straight up platforming and combat. It focuses on just being a fun game, and I never thought it felt gimmicky. Since the gameplay variety is primarily centered around combat, some people believe it's still repetitive, and some people just see Crash as a platformer and look at the combat as something that should just be an afterthought. I personally don't mind the more prominent combat at all. Plenty of platforming is still present in the game, it's just thrown in between all the combat, which balances the game out. The pace changing, new environments, and all the new mutants and abilities that are introduced throughout the levels, they all stop the game from getting too repetitive in my experience. I just have a blast every time I play this game. The only levels that really bore me are the Factory and Doominator stages, which to me have uninteresting environments with some tedious segments, with the exception being episode 11 of course. The gameplay in Crash of the Titans is not bad at all, and it's just Radical Entertainment taking a more experimental approach to try and bring more life into the series. This isn't just some random developer butchering the series. Radical actually cared about Crash Bandicoot and wanted to see the series prosper. Fans never talk about the game's cool set pieces or the attention to detail. It's always just whining about the designs or the game having a new formula. I think the game plays very well, and it doesn't deserve anywhere near as much hate as it gets. Another thing this game doesn't get much credit for is its visuals. A lot of the game looks great with its vibrant colors and well-designed, gorgeous environments. Take episode 14 for example. The backgrounds, the caves, it all just looks so good. The devs even stated that the game's textures are hand-painted. The art direction for this game is severely underrated. Crash of the Titans may not be what you're used to seeing in a Crash Bandicoot game, but it's still a fun Crash game at the end of the day. It gives us a different take for the series, and for what it is, I think it's pretty awesome.
Oh, I love this part! I could be on Cyborg Idol if that show existed. Why don't they make that show?
The music in Crash of the Titans is dynamic and changes based on the environment and what's going on screen. Because of this, the music almost never gets repetitive. I just love it when games do this, and for a game like this, it works perfectly. It's not a lazy random playlist, it's a soundtrack designed to fit the vibe of what's around you. The music is actually very underrated and not very many people talk about it. A lot of people seem to think it's forgettable, but that's just because they never actually listen to it. Fortunately, you have people like me, who listen to the entire soundtrack every week. I think a lot of it is pretty good. Some of the tracks are chill and vibey.
You'd think he was an Italian plumber or something.
Some are epic bangers.
My nuggets!
The music in Titans has a lot more variety than the original Crash games, which only really had one track per level, and it was always based on whether it was a certain type of vehicle level or whatever environment the level was in. It worked for those games, but I think the dynamic design in Titans is better. Action music plays when there's action, platforming sections are nice and vibey, I love that shit. The only issue is that sometimes the music shuts off randomly, but that's not very common. If you guys are interested, the soundtrack is available on Apple Music. Trust me, I listen to the soundtrack at work and it keeps me motivated and focused. If you listen to the music enough, it may just grow on you just like it did for me. With all that being said, is this game worth it? Well, that depends on what type of Crash fan you are, or how open-minded you are in general. If you're too fixated on Naughty Dog's original vision for Crash Bandicoot and don't like change, don't buy this game. You won't like it, so don't even waste your time. If you think some of the immature writing and the change in personality and tone for some of the characters are a bit too much for you, or the beat 'em up gameplay just doesn't appeal to you, don't buy it. If you never had a chance to play Crash of the Titans and don't mind Crash being a platformer beat 'em up, I recommend you to give this game a shot. Or if you've never played a Crash game before and you think this game looks fun just from watching this video, you might just enjoy it. If you can find this game cheap online, I think you should go for it. Crash of the Titans is a solid experience and it serves itself as a different perspective from the Naughty Dog games. It still contains some of Crash Bandicoot's iconic elements, but it presents it all to players in a different way. It's a very divisive video game that pisses off random people on the internet, and I personally feel that the outrage isn't justified. Twinsanity gets a lot of love from the community just because it expands upon the Naughty Dog games, even though it's an unpolished, glitchy mess that's admired more for its potential than what we actually got. Then you have the Naughty Dog games, which are put on so high of a pedestal despite being the most bland games in the series. Meanwhile, Crash of the Titans is a very functional game with good music, fun fighting mechanics, and loads of new ideas. Calling this the worst Crash game while overpraising the most broken Crash game is just borderline insanity. I'd give Crash of the Titans a 7 out of 10 with a stick of butter, so you guys can add flavor to the comment section. Bring it on, I'm ready. And since you all made it this far into the video, I'll give you guys a buying guide. The console version of Crash of the Titans is available on PS2, Wii, Xbox 360, and PSP. There are pros and cons to each version. Both the PS2 and Xbox 360 versions of the game actually receive extra months of development to help improve the graphics before final release. Also, if you play this game in 4:3, the cutscenes will look cut off, since the game was primarily made for widescreen. The PS2 version of Titans is the one I originally played as a kid. On PS2 we got native widescreen support, but unfortunately no progressive scan. This gameplay was recorded with Sony component cables on a PS2 Slim in its original 480i resolution. The game looks decent on PS2 with component cables, but I don't recommend playing this or any PS2 games with composite cables on a flat screen. Sometimes the PS2 version struggles to maintain its targeted 30 FPS due to the weaker hardware. And while this version supports Dolby Pro Logic 2, the audio is still very compressed and not pleasing to hear. But the PS2 version is very playable, and I would still recommend it if you don't have access to the other versions. The PSP version of the game, however, this is the portable version of the game that you can take with you. And while that may sound cool, this port is a fucking joke. It was outsourced to a different developer and it's a significant downgrade. Unlike its PS2 counterpart, the game strangely targets 60 frames per second, but it struggles to even be remotely playable during combat. Crash has no real-time shadow, which makes platforming less than ideal. It also has trash audio quality with a lot of missing sound effects and voices. Imagine this, you jack a mutant and then when you do a special attack, there's no sound at all. Really? Half the time you don't even know when you're hitting someone. This is just awful. And every time somebody speaks, the audio is distorted and the characters have deeper voices. All the facial expressions are limited to just creepy smiles. Crash only has one idle animation, and worst of all, we have long loading times. Apparently the PSP 1000 takes 20 or more seconds to load, while the newer PSPs, however, aren't as bad. The co-op from the console versions has also been removed entirely. Instead, you get 5 stupid mini-games with maps that are apparently too large when you don't have 4 players. You may also experience connection issues with them as well. It would have been at least cool to have ad hoc mode, but nope. The game on PSP has dumbed down to the point where you kinda just question why it even exists. You can't destroy the lockers on episode 11, and there's no color variety with the mutants. Everything is just below average here. The only good thing is that the broken puzzle on episode 4 actually functions as it should here for some reason. On console you can just jump around the wall, and that's so weird. While it sounds nice to be able to take Crash of the Titans with you on the go, this port is trash and you should stay away from it. Next we have the Xbox 360, which I'm sure most people would assume is the best version of the game. Well, it's actually the second best version, and I'll explain why. The Xbox 360 version obviously has the best visuals, outputting in high definition with higher quality textures and the best audio quality, and of course you get the stupid achievements and all that. If that's all you care about, then fine, it's the best for you, sure. But unfortunately, Radical decided that instead of making this version 60 frames per second, they would just add excessive motion blur and cap the game at 30 FPS. This is a common practice with games today, but the reason why it's so bad here is, look at this game, it looks like a blurry mess. And it feels so laggy every time you move, it just really puts me off. I mean, the game looks good when you're sitting still, but as soon as you start moving, oh my god. But looking past this, it's still considered one of the best versions of the game. I just wouldn't recommend it over the Wii version, which I consider to be the definitive version of this game. Now why is that? Well, the Wii version is the only version of the game that runs on a silky smooth 60 FPS throughout most of the game. The audio and visuals are much better than the PS2 and PSP ports, and it runs in 480p with widescreen support, which is good enough for most people. I believe this version of the game is also the version Radical primarily developed the game for. It feels the most polished and consistent. The only real complaints I have are that I can't do the rapid fire exploit with the range mutants, the game doesn't use Carbon Crash while you're wearing skins, or how the freezing mechanic visually looks like shit. This version may not be as pretty as the Xbox 360 version objectively speaking, but it still looks good and plays the best out of all versions. And I think that's what really matters. Despite having mandatory motion controls, the Wii version is actually the most flexible and responsive. That means a lot coming from me because I hate motion controls. You get to play around with the cursor during cutscenes and change the cursor to different icons. You also get to use the cursor to collect nearby mojo instead of having to run beside them all the time. This is awesome, especially if you have OCD. This makes collecting mojo so much better, and it might actually change the experience for some of you. I definitely recommend the Wii version over any other version. Now that we've made it to the end of the video, I'd like to thank you guys so much for your time. I've been wanting to make this video for years, and I'm happy to finally have a full video of me rambling about this game on my channel. The game is cool. The community, not so much. Have you played Crash of the Titans before? If so, did you like it, or did you think it was a waste of time? Feel free to express your thoughts in the comment section below. This has been a Fred review, and I'll see you next time.
Need a new job? Are you hiring?